presentation and the introduction, and thank you all for coming today. I'm going to be talking about my book, Neoliberalism's Demons, and the task of presenting the work that I did in that book is a little bit strange for me. And part of that stems from the unique experience of time that befalls the individual who's been caught up in the machine of academic publishing. You write the full manuscript, then wait for some indeterminate amount of time for a pair of reviewers to read and respond to it. Then you need to revise that manuscript to meet the demands of those like two people before you can begin the process of reaching hopefully a larger audience with the published work. The period when the book is actually in production feels as though you are in an isolation chamber. The only person in the world who fully understands the idea that you came up with in the book. My process for Neoliberalism's Demons was as short as it probably could have been, but it still took over a year between when I submitted the original manuscript and when it appeared, which was an agonizing wait given that the book talks about contemporary events. So the easiest path for me to take in this presentation would be to just rehearse what I argue in the book in a summary form. But my mind was not in stasis while I was in the isolation chamber. I have also been enjoying a series of interesting conversations about the book that have led my thought in new directions, as I'm sure our conversation today will do as well. So I want to share with you what I discovered in my book, but I also want to share with you something that's new and fresh to me. And I'm going to try to attempt to bridge that gap by revisiting the circumstances that led me to write the book in the first place, in the hope that the benefit of hindsight will make that process appear in a new light for me and provide some value add for those in the audience who may have actually read the book already. So this project began as a spin-off of my book, The Prince of This World, in which I studied the genealogical roots and the modern legacy of Christian ideas about the devil. While the devil has appeared as an important fictional character in modern European literature, my concern was less with modern responses to the literal figure of the devil than with the long-term effects of the kinds of theological questions and problems that arose in trying to understand the devil's place in God's creation. In my reading, these problems all converged on the question of freedom. Let there be light. What does it mean for the creature to be free in a world created by an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God? And more specifically, what does it mean for a creature to rebel against a God like that? This question obviously arises in the case of humanity as well, but the story of Adam and Eve includes many mitigating circumstances that muddy the waters. Eve's apparent misunderstanding of the commandment, which she received at second hand from Adam rather than directly from God. The serpent's persuasive critique of that commandment. And the general limitations of human impulse control. Most importantly, some kind of evil, or at least mischievous force appears to exist prior to Adam and Eve's disobedience, namely the talking snake. And the Christian tradition was more or less unanimous in identifying that talking snake as Satan, who was a high-ranking member of the angelic host, who led some of his colleagues in a fruitless rebellion against God, and now attempts to lead humanity astray out of sheer spite. Here the problem of freedom is set in much starker terms, because many of the mitigating circumstances that we see in the Garden of Eden story are absent.
Keep talking.
An angel is a spiritual being with much more direct knowledge of God's nature and intentions than a human being has. And angels apparently lack for nothing, having been created in a perfect and immortal state from the very beginning. Why would a privileged creature like this turn against God? Many theories have been offered, all of which are variations on the theme of wounded pride. In some early accounts, Satan got wind of God's plan to become a human being through the incarnation, something that in these theories would have happened whether or not humanity sinned. And he was offended that God would give such divine favor to disgusting meat-based creatures like human beings. And if anybody has ever lived in a body, they know bodies really are disgusting. He had a point. Hence, he set out to sabotage humanity in order to prove their unworthiness of God's favor. Satan's motivations in this story are certainly not admirable, but they're at least understandable. Later theologians, however, undercut this narrative by claiming that Satan not only rebelled before the creation of the heavens and the earth, but as his very first action upon being created. He's created and then instantly rebels against God. The apparent goal of this idea was to make Satan as evil as possible, hence there are no mitigating circumstances because nothing has happened in his life yet. And he's evil for as long as possible, because he is rebelling from the very second instant of his existence. That first instant of goodness was necessary for two apparently contradictory reasons. The first is that it provides God with a sliver of plausible deniability in that he created Satan and his minions as good angels initially, even if the second they rebelled. The second point, which becomes increasingly important over time, is that it actually ensures that Satan is evil. This is because if God had created them directly evil, then they wouldn't even be evil. They would just be following their nature. Moral evaluation requires some type of free choice on the part of the creature. And in this case, what theologians say is that in the instant after they come into existence, God peremptorily demands their absolute submission, and a certain number of the angels willfully refuse. A minority, but a significant one. They have estimates of this. Some theologians think as many as a third of the angels rebelled. It's unclear where they're getting this information. In any case, faced with this very strange story, we're forced to one of two conclusions. Either creation got off to like a really bad start, or this was God's plan all along. And given that the mainstream theological tradition's entire reason for existing is to justify the way of God to man, it is unsurprising that theologians tended to take option number two. St. Augustine even goes so far as to say that the existence of evil enhances the beauty of creation, much as line and shadow enhance the beauty of a painting. At issue here is not just the truism that good appears more clearly if we have evil to contrast it with, but the idea that God actually displays his power and glory more clearly, that he shows himself to be stronger, wiser, and more far-sighted if he draws good out of our evil choices than he would from simply basking in our unrelenting obedience. So if we were good all the time, God wouldn't have so many opportunities to show his glory, to show that he can overcome evil. So, in the turn of the screw, we can say that to maximize his glory, God had to make sure that some number of his creatures would rebel against him freely. And he did so by issuing a completely meaningless, completely context-free demand for obedience to a group of creatures who were only 1 instant old.
Who are only
1 instant old, like 1 year old, 1 instant old. In other words, the devil and his minions were set up to fail, all for the greater glory of God. I named this dynamic of moral entrapment, where you're intentionally induced to do the wrong thing by an authority that then punishes you for it. I called this phenomenon demonization. We tend to think of demonization as just saying exaggeratedly negative things about somebody, but my definition is actually more theologically precise, because this is the way that God creates demons in the first place. This is the way God generates demons for his own glorious purposes. So I'm sure that we all realize that demonization in this sense of moral entrapment did not stop happening in the second instant of creation. In fact, it seems to happen more and more in the ostensibly secular modern world. In the book, Prince of this World, I talked in very broad terms about modern concepts of freedom, but as I was finishing up the manuscript, I started to think more about contemporary applications. More specifically, I suspected that this concept of freedom as demonization could help us to understand the political economic order known as neoliberalism. Hence, I posted a question on Facebook asking if anybody wanted me to come lecture about neoliberalism and the devil. And people said yes. Specifically, and much to my surprise, a colleague at the Australian National University, Monique Rooney, who invited me to be a short-term visiting fellow at her institution, a position that I used as a base to lecture in a number of places in Australia and New Zealand. And this creates mixed feelings in me because no matter how evil and destructive Facebook is, it did get me a free trip to Australia. So I I don't know, you do the math on that. So neoliberalism has been much discussed in the wake of the 2016 Democratic primary, and of course in the wake of the disastrous outcome of the 2016 election. At the time that I was first musing about how to connect my concept of demonization with neoliberalism, however, this was early fall of 2015, the debate over neoliberalism was largely confined to academic circles with some discussion among left activists. Widespread interdisciplinary interest in neoliberalism began to emerge in a serious way with the publication of David Harvey's Brief History of Neoliberalism in 2005. But it began to pick up steam in the wake of the global financial crisis, which coincidentally is when I wisely chose to graduate with my PhD. This concern with neoliberalism largely displaced an earlier fascination with questions of sovereignty and political theology that had dominated during the early Bush years, when the decider appeared to be more or less invincible in his quest to remake the face of the earth in America's own image. The hegemony of evangelical Christians in Bush's coalition also made political theology's investigation of the often uncanny parallels between political and theological systems seem especially urgent. So I was in grad school during this time of transition, and I was immersed in both of these discourses. In retrospect, I pursued the two interests in parallel, never really crossing them over. In my work on Giorgio Agamben, who did so much to popularize the question of sovereignty in the early 2000s, as in my research on the history of Christian theology, I was following the path of political theology, while my trilogy of short books on pop culture used the transition from Fordism to neoliberalism as a basic framework for understanding the shifting trends in contemporary television. So the idea to connect the theological concept of demonization to neoliberalism seemed like a chance to combine the two streams of my work into one cohesive, unified project, which was very appealing to me. But there was one small problem. Neoliberalism and political theology are supposed to be completely incompatible. What I was proposing to do was impossible. So this is probably the time to begin defining my two key terms, neoliberalism and political theology. Most accounts of neoliberalism present it as an attempt to subordinate the state to the economy. In Will Davies' words, it is the disenchantment of politics by economics. While in Wendy Brown's influential critique, it is the attempt to extinguish the political altogether and make all of life economic. Political theology, for its part, is often viewed as being focused all but exclusively on the state and its sovereign powers, which are viewed as parallel to theological views of God's powers. Hence, political theology seems to focus on everything that the neoliberal order is rendering obsolete and irrelevant. Yet here I was, staring at a theological concept that seemed to be strikingly similar to the dynamics of freedom under neoliberalism. And this was not some minor ancillary point. Free choice is arguably the single most important value in neoliberal ideology, which views collective agents like government or labor unions as a continual danger to our individual freedom. The ideal society in the neoliberal world is one where individual freedom, specifically the freedom to enter into contracts, to exchange goods, and to compete in the marketplace, is maximized to the greatest possible degree, to the exclusion of all other factors. If those conditions are met, that means that political and economic outcomes are legitimate, because the market impersonally aggregates our individual choices to reveal what we all collectively really want. So the way things are in the world is what we want in aggregate. These economic choices that we're making are more than purely economic. They're moral, too. In addition to maximizing our own utility, our free choices provide the basis for the market to pass judgment on us and on our value. In extreme cases, wrong choices can mean being excluded from the circle of human value, just as Satan and his minions were excluded from heaven. A vivid example of this comes from the AIDS crisis in the 80s, which, as Melinda Cooper reminds us in her amazing book, Family Values, which you should all just immediately go buy, preferably at the seminary co-op rather than at Amazon. The AIDS crisis was one of the earliest tests of neoliberal policy under the Reagan administration. Where most people would have seen a severe health crisis, neoliberals saw a moral crisis. The gay men who were contracting AIDS were making free choice to engage in risky sexual practices, even after the existence of the disease among the gay population was known. Of course, from the common sense perspective, the gay men who contracted AIDS could never have fully known the consequences of their actions when they had sex the time they were infected. It was still not clear at that time how the disease was even transmitted or how it could be prevented. And obviously nobody chooses to contract a fatal disease. Yet neoliberal theorists presupposed that they were calculating and accepting the risk of contracting AIDS every time they had sex, meaning that they were ultimately responsible for their own infection, and hence not worthy of government help. Why should the government be subsidizing their risky choices? This supposedly free choice makes no more sense than Satan's supposedly free choice to consign himself to eternal damnation from the second instant of his existence, with no real knowledge of the stakes or consequences of his actions. And it makes no more sense than Adam and Eve's free choice to disobey God in an arbitrary way under threat of a punishment, death, that they had no understanding of. Nothing had ever died at that point in the story. Yet theologians and neoliberals alike insist that respecting the dignity of these supposed choices, including their dire consequences, is necessary to the moral order of the universe. Most neoliberal scenarios of choice are not so extreme, though. Often there is genuinely some time for deliberation and reflection. Yet in those cases, the options are usually so lopsided that the choice is an empty one. A major example that many American young people face is the choice of whether to take on student loans. On the one hand, they are constantly told that a college education is the only possible path to a moderately comfortable and secure life, and that the benefit in higher wages more than makes up for the debt that they're going to take on. This is good debt to have, and this is what people tell them. On the other hand, most often we are dealing with young adolescents who have never lived on their own and never had any serious financial obligations at all. Hence, the prospect of a lifetime of inescapable debt seems very abstract to them. There's no way they can really understand what they're taking on. Once they have made the forced choice to go to college and take on this debt to do it, they are confronted with other forced choices. For instance, they have the choice to either follow their authentic interests or to go into a practical field that will ease their path to employment, supposedly. And with so much on the line financially, it's not surprising that an increasing number of students freely choose to go into business, marketing, or other job-oriented fields to avoid dying on the street like you would with a religion or literature major, supposedly. By the way, that's not actually true. Liberal arts majors are very marketable, but for whatever reason, they don't choose to tell you that. So the one chance in their life that these students have to experience intellectual self-discovery, to study what they want to do, to just really engage intellectually, is spent slaving away for the benefit of their future employer. All freely chosen, of course. I will say that to depart from my script a little bit, I was just in Pakistan giving a lecture about my book project, and they're about to approach the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, for the 13th time to help refinance their loans and give some economic stimulus. Now they are freely taking on these loans, supposedly. They are freely choosing the conditions that go along with them, conditions that we all know do not actually allow for genuine economic development. The countries that have kind of caught up to the West take very different policies than what the IMF imposes on countries. And so they're freely kind of locked into this cycle of failure and then blamed for their economic outcomes. I attended a panel at this conference that I was speaking at about the economy of Pakistan, and it was amazing to me. Except for the fact of going to the IMF, everything that they said could have been said in an American Talking Heads program. The policy prescriptions were absolutely identical to what you would see on like CNBC or something like that. Even though, looking around, Pakistan was radically different from the US. But the neoliberal best practices were supposedly the groupthink that they had to oppose, even though it hadn't worked the previous 12 times. But they're kind of freely entrapping themselves into this, this cycle of dependency on these debts and this, this type of economic program that they know is not really going to deliver the results that they need. But again, freely chosen. They freely chose to enter into this, and it's their fault, according to the international observers, if they don't grow like they want to. So what I think is that all of these examples highlight the central role of public policy in neoliberalism. The debate over how to respond to the AIDS crisis was fundamentally a debate about how best to allocate state resources to shape the right kind of moral incentives in society, even if they were, from our perspective, perverse moral incentives that resulted in many needless deaths. And I'll pause to remark that, lest we think that crass bigotry is an innovation of the Trump era, Reagan's press secretary once indulged in homophobic jokes when asked about the AIDS crisis. The regime of student loans results from a conscious decision to remove state subsidies for higher education and place more responsibility on individual students and their families, again to make sure that the state wasn't subsidizing unwise choices like majoring in literature or becoming politically active in college, probably more to the point. And we can tell how international organizations like the IMF, are trying to maintain a certain economic hierarchy among countries by kind of trapping lower income countries permanently in that condition. In a certain sense, you could say that we're dealing with a subordination of the state to the economy. But the state is clearly an active agent concerned with shaping society on a very fine-grained level. We could just as easily say that neoliberalism is a system where the state controls people by using economic mechanisms, just as God pursues his greater glory through managing the ostensibly free choices of his creatures. So pursuing this possible connection between political theology and neoliberalism and the idea of demonization as moral entrapment led me to reconsider both aspects of this project. Both neoliberalism and political theology needed to be rethought. On the one hand, the conventional view of neoliberalism as a direct implementation of Ayn Rand style laissez-faire libertarianism seems limited at best, because the state is not simply getting out of the way of the economy. The state is very, very active in shaping society according to a very determinate model. On the other hand, the emphasis on God's indirect management of free choices seems to indicate that the direct assertion of sovereign authority may not be the last word on political theology. To think both of them together, we would need to think both of them differently. In The Prince of This World, I had already taken a major step towards rethinking political theology by asking a preliminary question. Granted that there are many parallels between political and theological systems, why should such parallels occur? And I concluded that political and theological systems take a parallel form because both are responding to a similar unfixable problem. On the theological side, we're talking about the problem of evil. How can God allow evil and injustice to happen? On the political side, it takes the form of the problem of legitimacy. Why do these people deserve to be in charge? Why should society be organized in this way and not in some other way? Neither question has a final, indisputable answer. And even at this level, I think we can see that the problems are clearly interrelated. The problem of evil is asking whether God deserves to be in charge of creation. That is, whether God is legitimate. Should we believe in this God who allows all these evil things to happen? Should we trust him? And questions of legitimacy often come up when some type of disaster or injustice occurs. So evil and suffering cause the political order to be viewed as illegitimate too. So to understand neoliberalism as an order of political theology, therefore I needed to think of it as an order of legitimacy. and my analysis of freedom as demonization provided the basis for that. Freedom is why neoliberalism can present itself as legitimate. My lecture series in Australia and New Zealand, which took place in the summer of 2016, that is, during the American presidential primaries, provided an initial sketch of what that might look like. And I want to pause and say that I imagined that being in Australia would be a way to escape from the primaries, and especially to escape from the conventions. But as it turns out, the time difference was such that actually mid-afternoon, when I typically didn't have anything else to do, was when like the conventions and stuff were being broadcast and when everybody was tweeting about it. So I was even more immersed in it than I would have been in America. It was horrible. In any case, as a committed workaholic, I was already considering what my next book project would be. And I asked several of my colleagues down under whether my lecture might contain the seeds of a book. They were unanimous. No, it did not. This was definitely an article-sized idea. So when I got home, I returned to some of the key texts on neoliberalism in order to convert my lecture into a proper article with footnotes and stuff. And I noticed that even the most astute commentators, like David Harvey and Wendy Brown, seem to fall into the trap of viewing neoliberalism as a form of straight-up libertarianism. In fact, I found that more or less every commentator found it irresistible to point out the supposed hypocrisy of the active role of the state under neoliberalism. Every single book that I read, it's like, oh, they say they want to be economic only, and then the state exists. Oh, how hypocritical. It became very tiresome. So I began to think that this strange blind spot in the literature may warrant more extended investigation, but I ultimately went on to publish a version of my lecture as an article in the journal Theory and Event. And so I did a little self-scholarship here, checking like the sequence of events. Going back through my email records, I find that I initially submitted my draft of the article in October, hence before the election. It was accepted in January, before the inauguration. And I accepted the final text in February, which was published in April. I made only minor revisions, solely in response to peer review rather than current events. And in any case, very little had happened that was related to neoliberalism at that point. And the name Trump does not even appear in the text. What a blessed, innocent state I was in when I wrote that text. So hence the article represents the pre-Trump version of this project, and at that stage it was actually an article-sized idea. Trump made it into a book. So when I was in Australia and New Zealand, all anyone wanted to talk to me about was Trump. I'm sure anybody who has traveled abroad since Trump started being a thing has experienced this. All anybody wants to talk to you about is Trump. And I assured them all, as a knowledgeable political commentator, that he could not possibly win. And in a way, I was right. When people showed up to vote, millions more of them voted for Hillary Clinton, who was essentially the living embodiment of conventional neoliberalism. Yet, as we all know, in a cruel technicality, Trump became president nonetheless, and my reinterpretation of neoliberalism seemed hopelessly outdated to me. Surely we were entering into a whole new world, what journalists were calling the age of Trump, or I've sometimes called the Trumpocene. And neoliberalism, therefore, was dead and irrelevant. Trump had killed it, whatever. The more I reckoned with my despair and horror, however, the more I found that my basic scheme of freedom as demonization was helping me to make sense of what was going on in the brave new world that the Electoral College had consigned us to. Specifically, it helped me to see that Trump's demonization of women, minorities, and other vulnerable populations was not a sudden departure from the neoliberal order. Neoliberalism had always been an order of race, gender, and sexual practice. This insight ran counter to another commonplace about neoliberalism, namely its cosmopolitan character. According to this view, neoliberalism is constantly undermining traditional hierarchies of race, gender, and sexual practice, and aims at a race-blind, gender-blind world that affirms sexual minorities. Indeed, those old-fashioned prejudices actually work against the economic efficiency that neoliberalism prizes. Hence, the persistence of those biases in our world must represent a leftover element from previous social orders. And the fact that neoliberal politicians so often indulge their voters' prejudices on those points is a purely opportunistic move aimed solely at gaining votes. As in the violation of libertarian principles, we are dealing with hypocrisy rather than an intrinsic feature of the system. I'm well aware that hypocrisy happens. At one time or another, we are all guilty of hypocrisy because no one lives out their values perfectly. Normally, those are momentary lapses, however. If you think someone is always being a hypocrite, you may have misunderstood their motives. For instance, if neoliberalism constantly relies on state intervention to create, enforce, and bail out market structures, maybe that's not hypocritical. Maybe it's part of the system. And if neoliberalism is always compatible with racist, sexist, and homophobic outcomes, and neoliberal politicians always appear to be willing to indulge such prejudices, maybe that's not hypocritical. Maybe it's part of the system. These two supposed hypocrisies on the role of the state and the role of traditional prejudices take up the second and third chapters of my book, respectively. After establishing the basic outlines of the relationship between neoliberalism and political theology, centered on freedom and demonization in my first chapter, I argue in the second that the conventional distinction between the political and the economic has no analytic value for neoliberalism. Because neoliberalism, like every political theological order, thoroughly reconfigures the relationship among the various categories that are sorted under the headings of political and economic. Categories like direct and indirect agency, spontaneous and deliberate action, public and private, natural and artificial. These are all resorted in a different way under every political theological order. In the third chapter, I show that neoliberalism has always been concerned to reinforce traditional hierarchies of race, gender, and sexual practice using the mechanism of demonization, meaning that it is trying to set up a situation where those hierarchies are freely chosen by all concerned and hence legitimate. And one thing that my visit to Pakistan showed me was that I had neglected the fact that colonial hierarchies are also a big part of the system as well. And they want to make sure that the colonial hierarchy is established and confirmed too, again, through free choices, that these countries put themselves in this situation and chose to do it. And hence, the colonial hierarchy remains legitimate in the neoliberal view. So, setting aside these two cliches about neoliberalism, the idea that it's simply libertarianism, and that traditional hierarchies are somehow left over from the pre-neoliberal era, these two cliches, getting them out of the way, laid the groundwork for me to confront one of the most dangerous cliches of the age of Trump, or Trumpocene, the idea that Trump represents a break with or an alternative to neoliberalism. This idea led some political commentators, most prominently Slavoj Žižek, to claim before the election that Trump was preferable to Clinton because he would at least upset the status quo and open up the space for some alternative. You know, to paraphrase the Big Lebowski, at least it wasn't an ethos. In my opinion, this is contrarianism at its laziest and most foolish. The world would obviously be a better place had Hillary Clinton become president in line with the popular vote. In Zizek's case, his provocative remark does not even fit with his own past analysis, when he correctly argued that the prospects for the left are better with liberals in charge, an analysis that seems to fit with our recent experience that the Bernie Sanders phenomenon arose out of frustration with a moderate Democratic administration rather than out of, in response to a reactionary movement. There is much more space for alternatives to develop when activists don't have to waste their time fighting the kind of corruption, brutality, and outright nihilism that the Trump administration is throwing in our faces every day. The left is not helped by having to spend all their time fighting against stupid bullshit that obviously shouldn't happen. The real question for my analysis here, though, is whether all that corruption, brutality, outright nihilism, and stupid bullshit that obviously shouldn't happen is a break with neoliberalism. My short answer is no. This is not to say that Trump simply is neoliberal in a straightforward sense, if only because neoliberalism is a set of ideas, which he doesn't seem to be capable of processing in the conventional way. Instead, I think it's helpful to think of him as a parody of neoliberalism, exaggerating its worst features. First of all, it is not controversial to point out that Trump views the world as an endless series of zero-sum competitions. In that respect, he is neoliberal to the core. And he has mostly pursued straightforward neoliberal policies like tax cuts and deregulation. There are well-known areas where Trump has violated neoliberal best practices, like withdrawing from international agreements or imposing various trade agreements, or imposing various trade restrictions. But the way that he talks about these actions is revealing. He's constantly talking about how America has gotten a bad deal, how other countries are taking advantage of us, how they're laughing at us, etc. This fits with his general sense that he and his followers are constantly being cheated. The hidden premise here is that in a fair competition, the US and the best people, Trump's people, would win. Since they are not winning, or at least not winning as much as they want to, the system must be rigged. What outsiders view as Trump's own cheating and corruption, he and his followers view as a necessary countermeasure to restore fairness to the competition so that the right people will start winning. In other words, he's not offering us a way out of the endless competition of neoliberalism. He's offering to give us the pure form of neoliberal competition for the first time. This is what leads me to view him as a kind of heretic in the political theology of neoliberalism. We often view heretics as rebels and subversives, but they're not opponents of the religion that views them as heretics. They want to save it from itself. Specifically, they want to save the core truths of the religion from the corrupt and worldly institution that currently represents it. Just as Trump wants to rescue the ideal of a world where endless competition sorts us into winners and losers, and to save that order from the liberal globalists who have betrayed it. It is in this context that we should understand Trump's overt bigotry, which seems so contrary to the official cosmopolitanism of neoliberalism, as a specifically neoliberal form of bigotry. Once again, the hidden premise is that whites are superior, and a fair competition would reveal that. Any advantage, real or imagined, that non-whites enjoy must be the result of cheating. Hence, for instance, Latin Americans seeking asylum are liars who want to take advantage of us. Migrant workers are cheaters out to steal our jobs. Illegal immigrants are coming to the US to vote and steal our elections. We can extend the same logic to the movement that launched Trump's political career, birtherism, which claimed that the first black president was not an American citizen at all. It is impossible that Obama won fair and square, so he must have cheated. In fact, the very fact that he ran in the first place was a violation of the Constitution in the birther worldview. These specifically neoliberal forms of racism and bigotry help me to see that the racism and bigotry that were always integral to the neoliberal order. Think, for example, of the infamous figure of the welfare queen, the poor black single mothers who were supposedly defrauding the public purse in order to buy filet mignon and Cadillacs. This demonized figure was central to the campaign to discredit the welfare state as a parasitic institution that existed solely to allow blacks to take advantage of the generosity of the white majority. The fact that this was a pure fantasy, the fact that the welfare state actually worked hugely to the advantage of whites is not relevant. The fact that this narrative was sellable is what was relevant. We can also think of the setting where our public officials demand the same arbitrary and immediate obedience that God demanded of his newly created angels, namely police shootings, which are overwhelmingly committed against black men. We always learned that the police officer was acting out of sheer necessity. They just acted, they just reacted, while the victim had a choice and was therefore responsible for his own death. Inevitably, some episodes from the victim's past is uncovered that supposedly proves that he was no angel, kind of a euphemism for a demon. Police shootings, of course, happen within the broader context of the criminalization of blacks that Michelle Alexander has dubbed the new Jim Crow, And in the book, I argue that we should understand it as a specifically neoliberal Jim Crow. The Trump technicality also highlighted an intrinsic weakness of neoliberalism, its ambivalent relationship to electoral politics. Outside the Western world, we know that neoliberalism has often been imposed with brutal force, most famously in Pinochet's Chile. Within the developed countries, however, there has been a preference to obtain some form of electoral legitimacy, as is appropriate for a political theological regime that stakes its legitimacy on free consent. The initial imposition of neoliberalism requires an unambiguous electoral mandate, as seen in Reagan's sweeping victories. But once the system is in place, the major parties conspire to actively prevent lopsided victories by running fundamentally similar candidates who are equally committed to the neoliberal status quo. In the last 6 US elections, Obama is the only president to have won more than 51% of the popular vote. And he underperformed Bush the Elder, who is widely regarded as a mediocre failure. This is the region that the US has had 2 electoral college technicalities in 2 decades, after over a century where such a thing was virtually unthinkable. In extremely close elections, such as the neoliberal order engineers on purpose, flukes like that become more and more probable. Of course, if a competition between fundamentally similar candidates is not possible, the neoliberal order prefers to give us one acceptable candidate and one obviously dangerous candidate, so that the election becomes a forced choice. It's not just Hillary versus Trump, but Macron versus Le Pen. Like, we can multiply examples here. And most of the time, the voters do take the more responsible option. On the rare occasions when the voters do choose wrongly, or don't choose rightly enthusiastically enough to prevent an electoral college upset, the neoliberal establishment goes along with it, almost as a kind of punishment. Surely, if they experience the consequences of their irresponsible actions, the voters will choose rightly next time. What must be avoided at all costs, of course, is the emergence of a serious challenge to the neoliberal order, which is why the Democrats seemingly put more effort into stopping Bernie Sanders than into making sure the Midwest did not flip to Trump. What I want to suggest in closing is that the emergence of such an alternative is not only desirable, but absolutely essential to human survival. From the perspective of the environment, neoliberalism came at just the wrong time, dismantling structures of global decision-making and economic management for the public good, just as climate change was threatening to become irreversible. Tax credits and cap-and-trade schemes are not going to save humanity from the extinction-level event that is approaching. We need to radically change our economic and social order. We can't nudge our way out of this one. We learned from the financial crisis that disaster does not force people to do the right thing. And we should not expect that climate disaster will automatically make people do the right thing either. The mounting evidence of climate change certainly isn't preventing Trump from gleefully vandalizing environmental protections, for instance. The only way to do the right thing is to work towards doing the right thing. And to do that, we need to relearn the habits of collective deliberation and action that neoliberalism is constantly trying to destroy. The task of discovering a collective freedom that would pose a genuine alternative to neoliberalism's impoverished vision of individual freedom is a huge one, but our very lives depend on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. You know, we usually don't really touch on the theological around here. It tends to be a more a materialistic kind of viewpoint of life and whatever. Anyway, let me just see what we got here time-wise. And we have about 45 minutes we can talk. So we've got a few people here. I'm sure there's a lot of questions and perhaps people's comments about this. So I'm going to just, kind of try to hold down your coming up here and falling in love with this device, because we know we all love to talk, and that's understandable. But so to give everybody a chance. So I'm just going to open up the mic and we'll take it from there. Questions, comments, etc.
Nice, very good.
I was drawn to an analogy by your reference to God and the creation of Satan, or Mephistopheles, or whoever you want to call him, in order to show his, as a comparison to his all-powerful situation. And I was wondering whether the existence of the all-powerful capitalist system that we have, neoliberal capitalism, brought us Trump in order to compare to show the grand eloquence and necessity of neoliberal capitalism.
Excessive. Rockefeller would be a better example.
Yeah, I don't think that Trump was a necessary outcome of neoliberalism. I don't think that any type of like historical destiny is being fulfilled right now. But he is an understandable outcome of neoliberalism. I think that due to the reliance on very close elections, that this kind of fluke can happen, especially in a media sphere that is so unmoored from anything resembling truth, or that's so obsessed with a false even-handedness that they have to give equal time to, frankly, the fake scandal of the emails and Trump's, his entire life has been just like, the man should be in prison. Like, it's like, clearly the man should be in prison. Like, how is he not in prison? This is insane. How does the society keep rewarding this person? And so I think that the strategy apparently on Hillary's team was that Trump would be so manifestly unacceptable that people would be forced to vote for him, including, the suburban Republicans. This statement from Chuck Schumer that for every progressive we lose, we'll pick up a Republican in the suburbs. But of course, Hillary herself is the most demonized politician in America, and people have been hating Hillary for longer than my students have been alive.
But with good reason.
Right.
I'm not a Hillary fan by any means. I think that, but I have never heard a legitimate reason to hate Hillary from a conservative. Like, she is already so bad, but they've made up this fantasy vision of her. And so they were never going to vote for her. Like, the Republicans were never going to swing to Hillary. Hillary's the last Democrat they would ever swing to. It was a terrible mistake to nominate her in the first place.
Yes.
Even if it's unfair to her that this demonization campaign has had such a disproportionate effect on her. It's about more than her and her ambition. I think that blindness and groupthink and inability to see the potential consequences of what they were unleashing, I think that is typical of the neoliberal elite and the kind of brain rot that we see from them, just kind of, talking amongst themselves and their best practices and everything like that, and not allowing any reality to kind of intrude on those best practices.
I want to go back a little further in your talk about the relationship
Tip it up.
of theology and economy. I'm thinking of Calvin. Calvin had the idea that God is so infinite in his wisdom that we cannot explain why he allows evil in the world. And as we know later on, Calvin's teachings were taken up by the sociologist Max Weber in order to connect religion and economic activity. And this was, grounded in his work, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. So in this explanation, he tried to emphasize how the cult of the individual and individual responsibility came into being, and how it was secularized later on in order to worship success. So that was the frame of reference here was of capitalism. So I think, how do you connect the two concepts of capitalism and neoliberalism conceptually?
Could you repeat his question or parse it?
It's asking about I think on the one hand, the relationship between theology and economics, and also it seemed like there was a second sub-question about the relationship between capitalism and neoliberalism in specific. The latter is easier to answer quickly. I view neoliberalism as just the latest stage of capitalism, one in which capitalism becomes self-aware in a sense and starts kind of like colonizing all aspects of life, and everything has to be like capitalism shaped. There's no longer an economic realm. Everything is following the same logic. As for the theological thing, the connection that Weber makes, the theological account he gives of why we have a world full of people who are just nihilistically stockpiling money, that's one genealogical link that you need to make. Why would people think that this is a worthwhile way to behave? It's not a natural human way to behave. It's a specific cultural form. And I think I'm convinced by his account that this comes from Christian presuppositions and the attempt to kind of respond to the anxiety of predestination and whether you're saved, etc. The other genealogical link that I think you need to make is between the idea of divine providence and the invisible hand. Divine providence ultimately is saying that God takes all of our decisions, including our sinful decisions, and makes them work out for a greater good. The invisible hand supposedly does the same thing. All of our self-interested, short-sighted, selfish decisions actually add up to social benefit because the invisible hand is able to kind of process them and turn them in the right direction. Giorgio Agamben, among others, has shown that there is like a clear conceptual link, like that you can trace this metaphor of the hand, like from the Bible to Adam Smith. Like it's been hiding in plain sight the whole time. Like the invisible hand is a theological concept. There's the idea that, in the secular world, that maybe it's an emergent property of the market instead of like an outside agency, but still it follows the same logic that it's this kind of sorting device that is making sure that all our bad decisions kind of like turn out good. And like you say, God is beyond our comprehension. We can't know ultimately what his reasons are for how things are. We just have to trust. Like God's kind of like a black box. And early neoliberal theorists like Friedman and Hayek, they said one reason that the market is good is because it's a black box. Since we don't understand the outcomes, since we don't understand where they're coming from, that prevents kind of unjust interference, like humans trying to play God or something like that. It'll prevent totalitarianism or something if we rely on this kind of black box algorithm to make all social decisions. That would result in us being more free than if we consciously make decisions. And I think I've read some papers tracing like Hayek's like thought back to theology too. It's like it's a very interesting field of research that's really taking off right now. So I'd encourage you to dig into some of that scholarship if you're interested.
Thank you for your talk very much. You'll forgive me, but I think you need to move much closer to the microphone. You're supposed to be this far away. Thank you. You can move it toward you if you need to. I personally, within myself and my thinking, have an extremely theological bend, despite my being a fourth-generation atheist. I can't explain it. Sometimes even verges on Calvinism, but I look at things extremely historically, and I wouldn't see the least little bit of conflict between what was it, political theology and neoliberalism. Capitalism and theology, they got their start at the exact same time, in the exact same place, and they were always intertwined, and that was in the earliest state societies. The sovereign owned everything, was not a descendant from the gods. He was a god himself, and he owned absolutely everything in society. And the people who legitimized him were the scribes, the astronomers, the metallurgists, the inventors, the record keepers. They were all the same people, and they were the priests. They were all the exact same people. They didn't really even specialize too much. You go on to the idea of legitimacy and feudalism, which is a favorite of mine. Serfs, the only media the serfs got were when they went to heard the homily on Sunday, and the priest said that the reason that the Lord is in his manor and you're stooped over in the fields is because God says so. And that's all there is to it. And then you come to our nation, which was revolutionary by separating church and state, and they did that for economic reasons because of the experience with the back and forth of the stripes of religion in Tudor England, and that was very bad for economy. They learned their lesson. So I don't see any conflict. I don't think there's ever been any conflict. That's part of the neoliberal bullshit, just like the idea that that we don't spend half our tax dollars on war, which gets to something else you were saying before, which echoes a favorite aphorism of mine, which is empires don't need friends, they need enemies. And they need enemies abroad, they need enemies at home in order to keep I mean, everything, you mentioned the demonization. Before that, it was simply, we need to fight this enemy abroad and at home, and we have to make sacrifices, and nothing else is worthwhile except for this idea. Which brings me to the fact that it costs $1 million a year to keep a soldier in Afghanistan. You were talking about hypocrisy. I like mentioning to my friends, if it takes $1 million a year to keep a soldier in Afghanistan, maybe, just maybe, the reason that soldier is there is not military, because that's no way to run a military if it costs $1 million a year to keep a soldier there. Maybe the cart is before the horse, and the military is what's important, and where the soldier is, what he's doing, is not what's important. So, all this leads to a question, actually it doesn't lead at all, but my question for you is, I'm forever trying to understand the difference between neoliberalism and neoconservatism. And I sort of get the feeling my understanding was a little better in the past, but now that neoliberals have taken up the charge of the idea that the world can be better made through the military, I'm not exactly seeing the question anymore. I mean, I understand neoliberalism has at one of its cores the privatization, et cetera. But what I'd like you to speak on is, how do I tell the neoliberals from the neoconservatives? That's my biggest question to you, if it's a reasonable question at all. And thank you again.
Thanks. Neoliberals and neoconservatives have always been in very close alliance throughout the neoliberal era. I say, and they both converge on, I guess you could say, if the end is to legitimate traditional hierarchies and reinforce them, and the means are market mechanisms that make it seem as though everybody is freely choosing to be at their spot in the hierarchy, then the neoliberals kind of emphasize the means, and the conservatives emphasize the ends more. So there's a clear overlap between the two groups. I think like some of the neoliberal theorists like Gary Becker, they seem to be kind of amoral nihilists. But if you read Gary Becker's Nobel lecture, he's clearly concerned that families are breaking down and we need to find a way to like get them back together through like cutting Social Security so that parents can kind of like suck up to their children so the children will take care of them when they get old or something like that. And you know, neoconservatives, I think that there's been just such a long, like a generation-long hybridity between these two forces that even such a seemingly radical divergence like Trump, they still are using neoliberal means to try to get to the neoconservative ends. they're still using the same basic toolkit, even if they're using it in an unconventional way. So I think that I would view the relationship as kind of a Venn diagram. And I would say that most of the politicians who have been successful in our era are in the overlap portion of the Venn diagram, maybe a little bit further to the left or the right or whatever. But it's been such a solid bipartisan consensus, especially after Clinton kind of consolidated the neoliberal version of the Democratic Party, that distinguishing between the two, it's a question of emphasis, not of like two separate schools of thought, if that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, so as has kind of been stated before me, the idea of dehumanizing the other is not
Closer to the mic.
The idea of dehumanizing what is other is nothing new. It's been going on for generations. So one of my questions, I guess, is there a way to combat that? Or do you think, like, when Trump is voted out of office, if he is voted out of office, because there is a very real chance he may win in 2020. There's a real chance of that. Do you think that it ever can be eliminated, or that this will just be kind of a continual struggle, somewhat similar to what Simone de Beauvoir would say in The Ethics of Ambiguity? And then the other question I have is, individuality a way of distancing yourself from this, or fighting against this, countering this, recognizing the individual as like something unique, as another, like there's positive gains in that. So those are my questions.
Yeah, it's, when you put it in such broad terms of like dehumanizing the other, of course that's basically universal. I think that the way that neoliberal society does it is distinctive, because it is making, like if you read the Iliad, the Trojans and the Achaeans, like neither of them thinks that the other side is evil. They're enemies, but there's kind of a mutual respect or something like this. Like and they're very violent towards each other and abusive towards each other, but there isn't this sense of like, Trojans are just evil and need to be eradicated. There just shouldn't be Trojans, or there just shouldn't be, or they're corrupting the world or something like this. So there are different models of enmity. There are different models of kind of like opposition to the other. What makes neoliberalism distinct is its constant use of scapegoating, where if somebody is suffering, it means it must be their own fault. This is absolutely constant. I say in the book that if Job's friends were alive today, they would be libertarians, but specifically they'd be neoliberals, you know. And it's kind of like a society based on the principle of should have thought of that, you know. No sympathy. It's always like you can always trace their suffering back to some choice that they made. And I can, sorry about that. I can see how like greater personalization or greater like knowing of people as individuals seems like a good strategy to combat dehumanization, and it is. But I think that relying on this kind of individualization may not be as effective in the neoliberal order, because that whole order is premised on kind of isolating individuals and then to like kind of assessing their unique form of blameworthiness, or like why they and their specific personal narrative would deserve to have their life suck or something like this. This is where I think that an emphasis on more collective forms of agency and specifically thinking of forms of responsibility that transcend the individual and their individual choices is probably the best way to break with the neoliberal logic. That wouldn't be the case under every system or in every historical circumstance, but in our circumstance, that seems to be the best way to go.
Well, Adam, thank you very much for your presentation. It's really great, I felt. In some ways, really brilliant. I see two major aspects. I'd like to try to briefly address both of them. The first aspect is making this basic relationship, like theological demonization and the function of the legitimation function in the global order, and that is really just amazing. The second is your characterization of neoliberalism and the current moment. There, I guess I have a couple of bones to pick, so I'll try to just briefly do both of those. I have no question, I don't think. So, as to that basic relationship, what brings up to me in terms of demonization in theology, well, I mean, religion was the foundation of the state for millennia, or more than a millennium, anyway, Christian theology or Judeo-Christian theology. And so there's a kind of passing of the baton, perhaps, and those relationships we describe, I think, are really important and crucial. I guess beyond that, what comes to my mind is this book, The Chalice and the Blade, by Riane Eisler, that provides, I guess you could say, a delegitimation of the traditional reading of fundamental stories, and that and a look backward to what the order was like before Christianity. And I guess I don't know what to say beyond that. Then with respect to neoliberalism, I guess I feel it's a lot more complicated, and that neoliberalism is in a particularly deep crisis at this time. And I feel that your presentation tends to make more of a continuity out of things than I'm sure than the neoliberal, the people carrying the torch of neoliberalism feel. I guess to my mind, neoliberalism was sort of born, during World War II, the reconstruction of international institutions after the war. I guess I like Chomsky's reading of what was going on in the State Department, who got Bretton Woods, IMF, and all this stuff functioned more or less well for a long time, and right now finds itself in pretty deep crisis. And on the one hand, I see what you're saying in a sense is that the foundation of neoliberalism is power, and is a willingness to accommodate a tremendous number of contradictory forces within the society in order to maintain the overall enterprise. But then we have today a kind of situation where the idea of what neoliberalism would be that was birthed during World War II versus, say, Orwell's vision of the future, I don't think that's quite what they had in mind. So, and where things are heading, who knows exactly, perhaps somewhere in between. So I guess that's my perspective on the current moment.
Yeah, I don't know. I would distinguish between the post-war moment and neoliberalism. Simply because the IMF and World Bank existed in the post-war era doesn't mean that it was neoliberalism. I think those organizations had different goals and procedures. It's the beginning of the so-called Washington Consensus in the late 70s and early 80s that really makes the IMF and World Bank into an instrument of neoliberalism. I think you could say something similar about the EU, that in the immediate post-war era, the predecessors of the EU were attempting to kind of tame market forces to make sure that social democracy would be sustainable in the European sphere. When the neoliberal turn happened, then those institutions were moving in that direction instead. So I make a very sharp distinction, which the neoliberals themselves do as well, between the post-war, what I call the Fordist era, and now our neoliberal or post-Fordist moment. Neoliberalism is an attempt to re-legitimate and rebuild the market society with the awareness of the kind of tools of social control and state management that the Fordist era had revealed to exist. This is why they're they're not just dismantling the welfare state, they're not just dismantling the Fordist order, they're reorienting it so that, for instance, welfare systems become not systems of support, but systems of control, and like, you know, that force people into the job market or something like that. Yeah, I just want to emphasize the distinction between the immediate post-war era and the neoliberal era, because I think that we kind of miss what's going on if we don't make that distinction. I don't know if that makes sense.
Can you address liberalism, the economic model which people confuse with a social model, and neoliberalism, the relationship? And then can you speak to neoliberalism and financialization of the global economic relationships which existed in the 1700s, 1800s, even though we've been sold the bill of goods that suddenly all knew globalization. And then lastly, you spoke to the existential crisis being driven by the neoliberal model, which seems unable to step back and even save itself in these remaining days as the planet moves towards weather patterns that will destroy the basis on which we organize our society. Thank you. Do you need me to repeat something there? Or?
Yeah, I'm not. So you want me to
Well,
address the climate change thing, but also.
Well, the difference between liberalism and neoliberalism, and then the way neoliberalism, present day, over the last 50 years, has, and financialization, which has destroyed the productive capacity of the economy and turned it into the fictional creation of wealth, which then marauds the planet, seeking more and more totalitarian control over human behavior.
All right. First of all, when you talk about neoliberalism, you have to forget the conventional U.S. definition of liberalism. We're not talking about like Democrats. We're talking about the liberal order that prevailed prior to World War I, basically like the long 19th century model, a global market society founded on, you know, the gold standard, free trade, this kind of stuff. And Polanyi, if you read The Great Transformation, he shows that all of this was kind of like, the state was crucial in setting up all these relationships, but that there was a certain autonomy of market actors, and especially of like high finance in that era as well. That era culminates in World War I, where everybody just suddenly started killing each other for no clear reason. Then led to an even worse war subsequently. So people were like, maybe we need to change the system. Maybe this didn't work out. But there was a faithful remnant, the people who would go on to become the neoliberals, who said, no, we need to go back to that era. That was good. We can fix it. We can retool it. We can make it, you know, faster, better. We can rebuild it. This is a reference to the TV show, The $7 Million Man. Anyway, whatever his worth was, it was a lot of money. But
$6 million.
$6 million. I apologize
You're forgiven.
for that error. So they're consciously trying to return to that era. This is why it's like called a form of liberalism. But they have learned new lessons in the meantime from the existence of the welfare state and the Soviet model. They know what they're up against. They know that an alternative is possible. And so they've learned those lessons, and they were trying to like consciously build a much more thoroughgoing and kind of undislodgeable version of the liberal system. You're right to say that capitalism was global from the very beginning. As long as there's been capitalism, there's been a global market. The globalization hype of the 90s. I think it was more about the fact that the former Soviet lands were now like open for business. Like suddenly there was like a global economic space in a way that there wasn't during the Cold War. I think that's probably what they're thinking of. Financialization, I think, is an interesting problem. It's one of these things that commentators on neoliberalism sometimes like want to make the core of neoliberalism, like the core explanatory factor. I think it's a symptom of the deeper system. You need financialization if you want to avoid state planning, basically. If you want to avoid direct state planning, you need to put that planning power into the financial sector as a kind of like market of markets that will redirect funding according to the invisible hand, with people constantly actively trading and constantly, churning all of this money around, seeking out these profitable investments, so that it's too complex for anybody to understand, it's too complex to intervene in. If things go wrong, all you can do is just like throw a huge pile of money into it, and then it churns it. Like one of my unpopular opinions is that in the system as it currently exists, the bailouts after the financial crisis were the only possible solution. The problem isn't that they chose to do the bailouts and they were wrong to do it. The problem is that they were right to do it, that they had set up a system where that was the only solution. And that system is built for opacity. It's built for this sense of like complexity for its own sake, to prevent the kind of collective control over our economic destiny that neoliberalism views as kind of the absolute demonic outcome. If you start to talk about anything like planning in the economy, like before long we're all going to be in the gulag, right? Like this is just kind of like an instinctive reaction that they have, with like the deep muscle memory of neoliberalism, that this is the worst possible evil. And again, that's what makes it neo too, because in the original liberal order there was no sense that something like that could happen. There was no fear of it. Now they know that it could happen and they're afraid of it.
And the environment?
The environment,
And neoliberalism's inability to respond, which would be, it would have to commit suicide.
yeah, at this point it seems like it. There have been limited like success stories of neoliberal strategies working on environmental issues. Like acid rain was actually fixed through a cap and trade program. And it's possible that had something like cap and trade been implemented like in the 90s or early 2000s, that maybe it would have made a big enough difference. But now we're kind of past the point, I think. The change, like the shift would have to be too big, and also nobody would trust the companies reporting their emissions anymore. Like that kind of trust and legitimacy has broken down. A cap and trade scheme would depend a lot on self-policing and self-reporting on the part of corporations, and I don't think anybody would trust that anymore. That nobody will believe that they're not just like gambling and like emitting anyway or whatever. Like we saw that even in Germany, the most law-abiding country on earth, that the car manufacturers there were faking their emissions.
Volkswagen.
Volkswagen, yeah. So if even the Germans cannot be trusted, how can we trust, American companies? How can we trust, I don't know, third world companies or something like this? Yeah, so I think that both the size of the change necessary and the fact that the means by which it would operate have been so delegitimized post-financial crisis, I think there's just no way.
Thank you again. You spoke just now about the lessons of the Soviet Union. I assume you're talking about like social engineering, neoliberalism doing social engineering, or did I get that wrong?
It is social engineering.
I think they're taking their cue more from the welfare state than from the Soviet Union.
Okay. And I'm fond of pointing out that how the liberal democracies greeted fascism in the 30s. They asked for treaties, they held conferences, they set limits that they didn't do anything when they were broken. And how are the liberal democracies greeting climate change now? They have meetings, they have treaties, they set limits that nobody minds when they're broken. And I'd like to point out that fascism was a product of humans and climate change is a product of mostly chemistry and a little biology, and would be even less amenable to this solution than fascism was. And lastly, I suppose I have to point out as the compulsive historian that liberal democracies had to take on some of the characteristics of fascism in order to defeat fascism, particularly in their domestic policies, but that's a whole nother ball of wax. I'll admit to my own complete and utter selfishness. I sit at home and I have experiences and I think about things, and then I come here and talk about what I've been thinking about. And as a retiree, I sit around and watch World War II documentaries with my Amazon subscription. And then I ran into a bunch of documentaries that were propaganda, and they were said to be propaganda. It was American propaganda for the home front. And I must have sat through 2, 3, 4 hours of propaganda that was created both by the State Department, by the Army, by industry, and by private organizations. And I'll speak to that in a minute, but first I want anybody here really enjoyed or followed Man in the High Castle, the recent, okay, all right. Well, then you know, for a very quick summary, the premise of the series is that the Axis won World War II and colonized and occupied and divided America into 2 very horrible halves, and that there's actually a parallel universe where the Axis didn't win World War II, and there are certain individuals that can travel between the 2 separate universes, parallel universes, and they filmed the alternative universe where the Axis lost World War II and use it as a organizing tool to let people know that there's another alternative. Well, the reason I bring this up is because looking at the World War II propaganda films that were for domestic consumption, and they were obviously a caricature of who the American was and what the American is. As a cultural historian, I gotta say, it's like a view on a completely different universe. It is just as different a universe as is caricatured in Man in the High Castle. And although I'm sure the era of World War II was no golden age, it was, according to what they're saying, what they made the propaganda for, a completely different populace as far as I could see. One of the major differences is people understood that when you have a plate of something, that it came from an animal. It didn't come from a box in a store. People understood that the slice of bread you ate was made by a farmer who worked the land, and that resources and labor went into it. And I also want to say, as a cultural historian, that the country, although I won't say it was made better, it was made very different than today, with your talk of the ascendance of individualism and the stress on it, in that everybody had to work together toward a goal in this country in World War II. People who weren't soldiers worked 70, 80-hour weeks, and on, and people who did serve as soldiers had to serve with people very different from them, hence the unbelievably trite trope in all the World War II movies of a group of Americans. There had to be the compulsory New Yorker and the compulsory Appalachian and the compulsory cowboy, etc. This was not for no reason, and the world has changed since then in a way that I think has really helped the social and cultural element of the uber individualization, uber stress on the individual as cause for, or the cause as individual effort that we have now. People became more and more isolated as the extended family broke up, and then I remember people talking in the 80s or 90s about how individuals who worked at corporations, they could all hang out, everybody in the department might be of a similar class, and they could all go to a bar that catered to them when they went home, and eventually with the explosion of all the different entertainment and channels. They could watch news and programming that was all geared toward however they felt as a group or as individuals. And now we have individuals. I mean, they talk about the average child. I don't think they mean every child, but I think they mean children who have the means sit for 6, 7, 8 hours in front of corporate moderated screen time of one form or another. And it's also highly, highly atomizing and individual making. So when you talk, you're trying to interrupt, go ahead, please.
Well, I just, yeah, I think that you're right to
It's
point
that the cultural difference has really helped.
out.
Thank you.
Yeah, there is a huge cultural difference, and I think people do lionize and idealize that era of American history. We even see, you know, with the new movement for a Green New Deal, like obviously they're trying to recapture some of that FDR magic, you know, some of that era that you're talking about. But I think you highlight that society is very, very different right now. I think some people think that what we just need to do is go back. We just need to go back to what we had before. We need to return to the Fordist era. That it would be kind of a simple thing to reverse all these changes in public policy, and maybe it would be to like change the law. That's like a simple matter, I guess, if you're in Congress. But to change society like that is a much more difficult task. Basic forms of social solidarity that people experienced back then, we don't experience anymore. That rebuilding that kind of deep social foundation is a much more monumental task, and one that I'm not sure how to do, but it's something that we urgently need to figure out.
That was your last remark there. Yeah, this is going to be the last question, comment, and then you can summarize because we're bumping up against our time constraints. Yeah, I want to thank you. This was really. We've been all over the block here. You know, being firmly grounded in Calvinism, you know, since I was like this tall, you know, I could relate to, before I was prefacing, you know, the fact that like we're not really terribly theological, but you know, when you're talking about predestination and the elect and all that stuff, been there, done that. Anyway, what I wanted to do and what I wanted to say is I want to kind of try to sharpen all of what's been going down here. And I think that perhaps, again, I don't want to speak for you and I want you to express your ideas about this, but my concerns are like, they run like this. You know, just in my coming over here this afternoon, I had to drive about 9 miles. And on my way over here, I was on Austin Boulevard, and I passed the crime scene. I mean, there's the yellow tape out there and 20 Chicago police cars, and I'm quite sure, I didn't see the body in the street, but I'm sure it had just left shortly prior to my driving by. But, you know, and then, of course, driving around the craters in the road, and, you know, I'm looking left, you're looking right. I mean, you can see, you know, we're living in a civilization that's like in marked decline, not even addressing things like climate change and whatnot. I mean, just when we look at the civilization we're in, we're confronted with, on a political level, creeping totalitarianism. We're sort of stumbling. I hate using that word fascism because I think it's overplayed, but suffice it to say, and we've talked around and through about militarism, the fact being that half the population has zero net worth in America. What is it, 57 cents on every one of your tax dollars goes to what? Making bombs and missiles and building battleships and all that. So in the course of this very broad discussion that we've had here this afternoon, you spoke at several points. I heard you were talking about collective agency and the notion that, at least that's the way I was reading this, you know, this whole individualism thing that we've been living with, this nightmare that's, you know, it's a nightmare for many people, obviously not for everyone, but an increasing nightmare, if you will, for most of our people. how do you think, and this goes to this point, what you've touched on, it's kind of a what's to be done moment here. How can we move on this thing? I mean, what can we do to try to turn this around? Because it seems like, we're heading over a cliff. We can't quite see it, but it's somewhere maybe just over the horizon, and it could be just catastrophic. We just don't know how this is going to play out, but it looks bad and something must be done, so that'll be it. Take it away.
I think that we do see some spaces where people are beginning to practice this type of collective agency, and in a way it's available all the time. I think that sometimes what I try to do in my classroom is like trying to help people practice collective agency, at least collective deliberation. And we saw during the Occupy movement, they didn't have a policy demand that they were making, but I think the demand that they were actually meeting was the desire to come together, to have like some type of sense of a collective being in action. And I think that the fact that they chose spaces where they could be excluded from ultimately was like a problem. Like they needed to have like a set space where people could still come and go and meet together and hang out basically. To get, not to get out of the habit of meeting together. I think that's the first thing that we need to do is kind of overcome this atomization. Don't imagine that social media is going to be a replacement for actually getting together with people. Get used to living together and making decisions together. In my experience in the small community of Shimer College, where we all kind of had ownership of the institution in some sense that we could contribute to it, like that was a very valuable thing. It's something that's kind of been lost now in the new version of Shimer, but it was real. It can happen. It happens. This is not some abstract thing. It's something that happens. It's something that we've all probably experienced at one time or another. We need to find those spaces and cultivate them. I've said that that crisis doesn't mean that people are automatically going to do the right thing. Nobody can make us do the right thing. Nobody can, the people who are going to know the right thing to do aren't just going to like spring into existence magically when a crisis happens. I think we need to try to become those people. We need to, maybe we can't take power now, but we need to be the people who are going to be in a position to pick up the pieces. Something like that. Like, I don't know. I don't want to, I'm clearly not painting a rosy picture here. I think that a lot of the most probable outcomes are very bad and very negative. I think that the fact that all the worst people in the world have like the military at their disposal and the police at their disposal, that's some high odds against us. But if we don't try, it definitely isn't going to happen. So, and I'm kind of like Peter was describing earlier, like I'm a thinker. I'm somebody who just kind of sits around and has ideas. Sometimes I wonder why people are so concerned with how I should tell them to act, something like that. But I think we do need to, first of all, before we can do anything, we need to become a we. That's the first precondition. And there are ways to do this. I think we've all experienced them, and we need to do them more and more intentionally. So I guess that's my concluding remark.
Thank you very much.